There's a knock at the door. You're staying the night at the Dreamland Motel. The desert outside is quiet, still, holding its secrets in the shadows between the hills. But when you open the door, no one is there. Just an envelope, slipped under the frame. Inside is a strip of undeveloped film, black, coiled, faintly smelling of chemicals. When processed, it reveals a document typed on aging paper, stamped with a classification far beyond top secret. Across the first page, in sharp letters, a name: Majestic 12. Beneath it, a list of 12 men, scientists, generals, intelligence directors, real people, real power, but tied together by something otherworldly. What you're holding is either the greatest leak in the history of secrecy, or the most elaborate hoax ever planted in the annals of ufology. Tonight, we open the envelope and follow its trail through history. This is the story of the Majestic 12. Welcome back to the Dreamland Motel. Tonight, we'll be staying in, well, do I even need to say? If you enjoy what you hear tonight, consider supporting the show by liking, subscribing, or leaving a review. It helps keep the bed sheets fresh and the ice machine cold. And remember, each episode comes with chapter timestamps, so you can drift in and out of the story at your own pace. Now, settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's step together into the long shadow of Majestic 12. The summer of 1947 was not a peaceful one. Yes, the war was over. The factories of death had gone quiet. The parades had rolled through the cities, and most of the soldiers had come home. But peace was fragile, almost brittle, like glass that could shatter at any touch. In the skies above America, new fears were gathering. The Soviet Union had tightened its grip on Eastern Europe. The Berlin crisis was brewing. And though the atomic bomb had ended one war, it had opened the door to a new kind of fear. Fear of annihilation. It was against this uneasy backdrop that something strange appeared in the desert of New Mexico. On a ranch near Roswell, W. Mac Brazel found debris scattered across the sand. He described it as nothing like he had seen before. Pieces of foil that would not crumple. Lightweight beams, some with odd tape-like markings. He stuffed some of it into his truck and drove into town. At the Roswell Army Airfield, officers inspected the wreckage. Colonel Blanchard, commander of the base, ordered his public information officer to prepare a press release. On July 8, 1947, the world learned that the Army had recovered a flying disc. It was the first and only time the US military has ever made such a claim in an official statement. Newspapers rushed to print. The Roswell Daily Record ran its now famous headline, RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. Radio stations buzzed with excitement. George Walsh, a local broadcaster, interrupted programming to read the announcement. Phone lines jammed. Across the country, people leaned closer to their sets, imagining silver discs and little green men. But the excitement lasted less than a day. Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas, summoned reporters. He posed for photographs in his office, pointing to crumpled foil, wood, and rubber tubing laid out on the floor. It wasn't a flying disc, he said. It was a weather balloon. The papers dutifully printed the correction. The phone calls quickly stopped. The frenzy passed like a desert storm, brief and violent, leaving silence in its wake. Yet for some, the silence was suspicious. Why had the army called it a disc in the first place? Why had the story changed so abruptly? And what of the witnesses who whispered that there had been more? Not just foil and wood, but strange bodies, quickly taken away. Those questions lingered. They linger still. For those that are new to the Dreamland Motel, you'll find a full episode on the entire Roswell incident and the aftermath in my library of stories. But why am I talking about Roswell at all? Imagine yourself in Truman's Washington. The president was a man who understood secrecy. He had inherited it with the atomic bomb. Even as vice president, Truman had not been told about the Manhattan Project until after Roosevelt's death. The greatest secret in human history had been hidden from the second highest office in the land. Truman learned from that. Some knowledge was simply too dangerous to spread. It had to be compartmentalized, divided into pieces so that no single person held the whole truth. In July 1947, just weeks after Roswell, Truman signed the National Security Act. In a single stroke, America's government was restructured for secrecy. The Central Intelligence Agency was born. The first peacetime spy service in American history. The National Security Council was created, a small circle of advisors who would meet behind closed doors to plan in secret. The United States Air Force was made independent, its generals rising to prominence just as the Cold War demanded control of the skies. This was the architecture of permanent secrecy. And it was built at the very moment rumours of a crash in New Mexico were echoing across the country. If Roswell had been real, if something truly unearthly had fallen to Earth, it would not have been left to local officers or stray journalists. It would have been gathered into this new machinery, hidden, protected, and locked away. And in that sense, the idea of a group like Majestic 12 feels almost inevitable. Consider the names that would later appear on the mysterious MJ-12 documents. Dr. Vannevar Bush, the quiet New England scientist who had overseen radar, computing, and the atomic bomb. He had the trust of presidents, and he chaired the new Research and Development Board in 1947. If there were alien wreckage to study, Bush is precisely the man Truman would have called. James Forrestal, the nation's first Secretary of Defense, a hard-driving administrator, fiercely anti-communist, with clearance to know every secret America possessed. He was a man who carried the weight of the world. Hoyt Vandenberg, the general who moved seamlessly between intelligence and command. He was the director of Central Intelligence in 1946 to 47, then the Air Force Chief of Staff. The Roswell reports, if real, would almost certainly have crossed his desk. Roscoe Hillenkotter, a naval admiral chosen as the first director of the CIA after the National Security Act. In time, he would even lend his name to NICAP, a civilian UFO group, fueling speculation about his true beliefs. These were not obscure men. They were at the highest levels of power, already entrusted with atomic secrets and Cold War plans. Their inclusion in the MJ-12 papers, decades later, would give the documents an air of undeniable plausibility. Because if anyone were to be gathered into a secret council about UFOs, surely it would have been them. And here lies the paradox. Even if Majestic 12 never existed, the world of 1947 was already preparing for it. The Roswell incident planted a seed. The Cold War provided the soil. Truman's new security state built the walls around it. And the men of science, defense, and intelligence were already in place, ready to carry the burden. Majestic 12 may have been a forgery, a myth whispered into existence nearly 40 years later. But in the summer of 1947, with the Cold War tightening and secrecy hardening into policy, the idea of such a group felt not just possible, but necessary. It is the winter of 1984 in Los Angeles. On a quiet December evening, Jamie Chanderay, a television producer with an interest in UFOs, returns home to find a small, unmarked envelope pushed through his mail slot. No name, no return address, just a postmark from New Mexico. Inside, a sealed roll of 35mm film. Imagine the strangeness of that moment. You hold a film canister in your hand, with no idea who sent it or why. No explanation, no note, just the rattle of celluloid inside, as if it were meant for you, and you alone. Chanderay didn't open it immediately. He called his friend Bill Moore, co-author of The Roswell Incident, a book that had only recently ignited public curiosity about the 1947 crash. Together, the two developed the film. In the glow of the dark room, frame by frame, an image began to appear. It wasn't photographs at all. It was documents, pages upon pages of government memos. At the top secret, magic eyes only. The first page was brief, a single sheet dated September 24th, 1947. The text was simple, clipped, bureaucratic. President Harry Truman, addressing his Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal. The order to assemble a group with Vannevar Bush and others to investigate and manage the recovery of a downed disc in New Mexico. No flourish, no urgency, just a cold authorization, as though creating a subcommittee for agriculture or for budgets. Except this one was to deal with something not of this earth. At the bottom, Truman's signature. A mark that, if real, would be the most consequential stroke of ink in American history. Then came the larger file. 7 pages, labelled Magic Eyes Only, dated November 18, 1952. Presented as a briefing for President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower, authored by Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter, Director of Central Intelligence. The first section recounted Roswell, July 1947, a flying disc recovered in New Mexico, the wreckage sent to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And then, the claim that chills the reader even now. 4 small bodies, not human, extraterrestrial biological entities, dead upon arrival, autopsied in secrecy. The tone was flat, clinical, stripped of any wonder, but the words were staggering. The briefing went further. On December 6, 1950, another crash was listed. This time near the Texas-Mexico border. Again, the US military had recovered wreckage. Again, there were bodies. Unlike Roswell, this one was little known before the MJ-12 papers. But here it was, written as matter-of-fact history, not rumour, not speculation. 1 crash could be an anomaly, 2 suggested a pattern. To handle such matters, the briefing explained, Truman had authorized a permanent group in September 1947. 12 men, drawn from the highest levels of government, science, and the military. Their mission? To analyze recovered materials, advise the President, and ensure absolute secrecy. They were given a name, Majestic 12. And then followed the list of these men. Vannevar Bush, James Forrestal, Hoyt Vandenberg, Nathan Twining, Donald Menzel, Jerome Hunsaker, Sidney Sowers, Gordon Gray, Roscoe Hillenkotter, Robert Montague, Detlev Bronk, and Lloyd V. Berkner. Every man real, every man historically verifiable. Scientists, generals, and intelligence chiefs. To see them aligned together was what gave the document its power. Not fictional names, not invented ranks, but the architects of Cold War America, gathered in a list that whispered of alien wreckage and dead bodies. The closing sections stressed security, that Majestic 12 was above top secret, that its existence itself was classified, that disclosure outside strict need to know was forbidden. The words were routine and bureaucratic, the same cadence as any Cold War memo about codes or weapons. And that, perhaps, was the most haunting part, because what they described was anything but routine. For months, Chandray and Moore told no one. They made copies, compared notes, whispered late into the night about what it might mean. Soon they brought in Stanton Friedman, a nuclear physicist turned UFO investigator. Friedman was meticulous. He scoured archives, cross-referencing every name, every title, and the names fit. The men listed in the documents were not nobodies. They were the exact men who, if such a group existed, would have been chosen. Friedman went further. He studied the formatting, the dates, the security markings. Some matched archival styles that weren't widely known at the time. For him, this was evidence. Either these were authentic, or they were the work of a forger with extraordinary knowledge. He became Majestic 12's most vocal defender. But where Friedman saw plausibility, others saw shadows. Bill Moore's name had already become entwined with controversy. He had a quiet relationship with Air Force intelligence officer Richard Doty, accused of running disinformation campaigns. Later, Moore would admit at a MUFON conference that he had, at times, passed along false information for government contacts. He insisted it wasn't about MJ-12, but suspicion had already taken root. Who had really sent that film? Was it a leak? A hoax? A carefully planted illusion designed to mislead as much as to reveal? Between 1984 and 1987, the papers circulated largely in whispers, copies passed hand to hand, hints dropped at conferences, the kind of secret you share in a quiet corner, not from a stage. And then, in 1987, they surfaced publicly. British researcher Timothy Good published excerpts in Above Top Secret. Stanton Friedman and Bill Moore began presenting them openly. And Jamie Chandoray, the man who had found the envelope in his mailbox, stood beside them. The UFO community erupted. For some, the documents were the smoking gun, proof that Roswell was real, that alien bodies had been recovered, and that a hidden committee had been running the cover-up ever since. For others, the flaws were obvious. Truman's signature looked Xeroxed. The prose didn't feel quite right. The delivery chain, an anonymous reel of film from nowhere, was simply too convenient. But instead of killing the story, the doubts only added fuel. Majestic 12 did not emerge from an archive, or a whistleblower on the record, or a congressional hearing. It arrived like a ghost, undeveloped film, slipped through a door, revealing secrets typed in a flat, clinical tone. Whether real or not, its impact was undeniable. It reshaped UFO lore. It gave new names, new villains, new heroes. It whispered of presidents briefed in secret, of autopsies behind locked doors, of a committee that decided humanity's fate while the rest of the world slept. And from the very beginning, it was cloaked in mystery. Not just what it said, but where it had come from, and why. Because in the shadows of 1984, someone wanted the world to believe. The power of the Majestic 12 documents was not only in the claims of alien wreckage and recovered bodies, it was in the names. Because these were not invented characters. They were real men. Men who had walked the corridors of power, signed the orders, shaped the Cold War. To read the list was to summon 12 ghosts, each summoned from the highest levels of their fields. And together they formed the council that never was, or perhaps always had to be. Vannevar Bush, the quiet architect of America's wartime science. Bush had overseen radar, cryptography, and the atomic bomb as the head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. By 1947, he chaired the Research and Development Board, reporting directly to the President. His reputation was of a man who could coordinate the most secret projects on Earth. If alien wreckage existed, Bush would have been the one to place it under lock and key. In the lore of Majestic, he becomes the archetype, the rational scientist standing at the threshold of the irrational. James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense, a tireless administrator, consumed by the burdens of post-war secrecy and Soviet rivalry. In 1949, he fell, or was pushed, from the 16th floor of Bethesda Naval Hospital. Officially, suicide. For conspiracists, Forrestal's death became proof that he had known too much, that he had tried to speak, and that Majestic had silenced him. Allegedly, he was a man unravelled by paranoia and exhaustion. In the mythology of MJ-12, his ghost lingers at the window, forever falling. After his death, he was allegedly replaced in the MJ-12 by General Walter B. Smith, a soldier diplomat, Eisenhower's trusted chief of staff during the Second World War, later Director of Central Intelligence. Unlike Forrestal, Smith was not a tragic figure, but a consummate insider, a man who moved comfortably in the corridors of power. He negotiated with allies and adversaries alike, and under his hand the CIA hardened into a true Cold War instrument. If Majestic 12 needed a steady chair at the table, someone who could speak both the language of generals and of spy masters, Smith fit the role perfectly. Hoyt Vandenberg, Air Force General, Director of Central Intelligence in 1946-47, then Chief of Staff of the Air Force through the early Cold War. It was Vandenberg who dismissed the Air Force's estimate of the situation in 1948, a report that suggested UFOs might be interplanetary. On the MJ-12 list, his presence is chillingly logical. A man already known for guarding secrets, already intertwined with UFO history. Roscoe Hillenkotter, Admiral, first Director of the CIA after Truman signed the National Security Act. Later, in retirement, he sat on the board of NICAP, one of the largest civilian UFO organizations. He publicly criticized the Air Force for withholding UFO data from the American people. How to reconcile that? Was Hillenkotter a true believer, angered by secrets he once held, or a man haunted by his own reflection in the mirror of Majestic? Nathan Twining, Air Force General, later Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, author of the famous 1947 Twining Memo, which declared that flying discs were real and not visionary or fictitious. A practical man, he called for systematic study of UFOs. On the MJ-12 list, his inclusion adds weight. He had already written the closest thing to official acknowledgement. In legend, Twining becomes the military spine of the council, the general who gave the unknown its marching orders. Donald Menzel, a name not unknown to this channel. An astrophysicist at Harvard, one of the most vocal debunkers of UFOs. He wrote books dismissing the phenomenon, explaining sightings as weather, astronomy, or illusion. He's the man responsible for what's known as the Menzel Gap, a topic I've detailed in full in my episode making the connection between AI and NHI. Menzel's presence on the MJ-12 list is ironic. Why would a public debunker sit on the most secret UFO panel of all? For some, it is the perfect cover. Ridicule in public, revelation in private. For others, it proves the documents a fraud. Menzel is another paradox of Majestic. Jerome Hunsaker, aeronautical engineer, MIT professor, chairman of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, a pioneer of aircraft design, a man who helped usher aviation from wood and fabric biplanes into the jet age. Hunsaker's presence represents science and engineering at its highest level. If there were alien craft to be studied, he would have been the mind to probe their designs. Sidney Sowers, Rear Admiral, the first Director of Central Intelligence in 1946, before the CIA was even created. A quiet man trusted by Truman, who remained close as a personal advisor on security matters. On the MJ-12 list, he is the thread that ties it all back to Truman himself, the president's confidant, the man who knew what others could not. Gordon Gray, a political insider, Secretary of the Army under Truman, later National Security Advisor under Eisenhower, deeply involved in intelligence oversight and national security policy. Gray was one of those men who always seemed to be in the room, never at the podium, perfect for Majestic 12, a shadow among shadows. Robert Montague, Army General, commander of the Sandia Base in New Mexico, where the nation's nuclear weapons were assembled. A man already living at the heart of the country's most secret programs. Montague's presence on the list ties Majestic to the desert, to New Mexico, to the very soil of Roswell itself. Detlev Bronk, biophysicist, president of Johns Hopkins University, later of the National Academy of Sciences, advisor to the military on aviation medicine, known for his expertise in human physiology. In UFO lore, Bronk's name surfaces in whispers of autopsies. If bodies were recovered, his was the expertise to study them. And finally, Lloyd V. Berkner, physicist, member of the National Security Council's Science Advisory Committee, instrumental in ionosphere research and later in founding international scientific programs. Berkner's role is less dramatic, but his inclusion reminds us Majestic wasn't just military muscle, it was scientific authority, cloaked in prestige. Taken together, these 12 names are what gave the MJ-12 documents their credibility. They were not fringe figures. These men were the architects of mid-century America. Men who held atomic secrets, who built the intelligence community, who carried the Cold War on their shoulders. To put them in a list was to anchor the fantastic in the real. And in the Dreamland Motel, when we speak their names one by one, they echo like ghosts, now half in history, half in myth. Majestic 12 may never have existed, but the men on that list did. And for many believers, that has always been enough. In the first years after their emergence, the Majestic 12 documents shimmered with a kind of untouchable aura, invoked at conferences like relics. But even relics can crumble when exposed to light. For while believers clung to the power of the names, the skeptics went looking for flaws in the details. and truth be told, they found them. The first cracks were small. Phil Klass, the debunker often called the Sherlock Holmes of UFO hoaxes, noticed them almost immediately. Klass was not an easy man to impress. He had built his reputation by dismantling UFO claims with stubborn, relentless logic. To his critics, he was smug, even abrasive. But to his admirers, he was indispensable, the hard edge of reason in a field drowning in fantasy. When Klass examined the MJ-12 documents, he didn't see a grand conspiracy. He simply saw a forgery. One of his earliest observations was about the typeface. The documents used a proportional font, letters spaced in ways that weren't common on government typewriters in the late 1940s or early 1950s. Instead, they resembled type produced by commercial typesetting or later technologies. Then there were the stylistic quirks, dates written in formats not typical for government memos of the era, phrases that rang oddly modern, unidentified aerial phenomena, words that would not become common until decades later. To Klass, it was simple. The documents were betraying themselves, not with grand revelations, but with the quiet ticks of their typing. And yet, for all the confidence in Klass's tone, his criticisms did not land as cleanly as he might have hoped. Take the typeface. Yes, it looked odd, out of step in the 1940s. But if these really were the most secret papers in the government's possession, documents briefing the president-elect on alien bodies in cold storage, why should they follow ordinary bureaucratic convention at all? In the world of intelligence, irregularity can be a feature, not a flaw. Paper can be deliberately chosen to conceal origin. Fonts and formatting can be shifted to obscure which office or which typist produced them. Even watermarks and ink can be manipulated. Security through camouflage. Think of World War II, when Britain's intelligence services produced entire arsenals of forged German documents, down to the precise ink and rag content of the paper. Authenticity was not in appearance, but in intent. And so, while Klass argued that proportional fonts betrayed the hoax, believers countered that they might just as easily betray the secrecy. After all, we have no authentic Majestic 12 document to use as a benchmark. We can't compare them to the real thing, because this is the real thing. Or it isn't. It is, in other words, apples and oranges, and ambiguity is the orchard. For the UFO community, that ambiguity was not necessarily a weakness. It was fuel for argument, for speculation, for the endless circling debate that gave Majestic 12 its half-life. Because in the end, Klass had his fonts, Friedman had his names, and between them lay the void where belief takes root. By 1988, the Majestic 12 papers had drawn enough attention that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was asked to weigh in. The FBI reviewed copies of the documents forwarded by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Their conclusion was swift, blunt, and final. Completely bogus. That phrase appears in the declassified FBI memo, underlining the Bureau's judgment. No room for nuance, no hedging, just one word that for skeptics should have been the end of the matter. And yet, in the UFO world, things are never that simple. Because believers looked at the same memo and saw something else. Confirmation that the government was watching, that the documents had rattled enough cages to require an official stamp. And when an official stamp says bogus, well, isn't that exactly what they would say? By the late 1980s, the UFO community was already fracturing. On one side stood Stanton Friedman, Jamie Chandaray, and Bill Moore, still insisting that the documents were authentic, still presenting them as the closest thing to proof of Roswell. On the other stood Class, along with other skeptics and cautious researchers, pointing out the flaws in paper, ink, type, and chain of custody. For many, the question wasn't just about Majestic 12, it was about ufology itself. Could the community tolerate evidence that came in such a suspicious form? A roll of undeveloped film, mailed anonymously. Could it accept a story that leaned so heavily on secrecy and so lightly on verifiable provenance? Or was ufology being gamed, manipulated by hoaxers, or worse, by the government itself? Complicating it all was Bill Moore. In 1989, Moore stood before a MUFON conference and admitted something almost unthinkable. He had, by his own words, knowingly passed along disinformation on behalf of Air Force intelligence. His handler, he said, was Richard Doty, an OSI officer already famous for his role in overwhelming Paul Benowitz with a storm of fabricated UFO claims. The story of Paul Benowitz and Richard Doty is explored in full in my Men in Black episode. Moore insisted Majestic 12 was not part of his disinformation effort, but the damage was done. Because if he could be used once, he could be used again, and the deeper question lingered. Why would he do it at all? Some said it was ambition. Moore believed that by cooperating, he would gain a seat at the table, a rare chance to glimpse the real secrets locked behind government vaults. Others saw ego. Being fed by intelligence sources gave him a prestige no other ufologist could claim, a validation that he was close to the truth. Moore himself described it as a bargain. He told the community he was working both sides, rationalizing that if he played along with the lies, he could steer the flow of information toward daylight, that a few falsehoods might be worth it if they pulled the curtain back on something greater. But in hindsight, it's just as likely he was manipulated. Doty and his colleagues knew how to play an ego, how to make someone feel indispensable while using them as nothing more than a delivery system for noise. The result was devastating. Instead of becoming an insider, Moore became a warning, proof of how easily a man can be turned, how fragile the truth could be once tangled within the machinery of deception. And that left the UFO community to wrestle with the hardest question of all. Was Majestic 12 itself a poisoned gift? Another thread in the same tapestry of disinformation? Or was Moore simply a pawn, chosen not to spread a hoax, but to carry something real into the light, only to have his credibility destroyed before it could be believed? The irony was almost unbearable. The very man who helped birth Majestic 12 was also the man who proved just how easily the UFO community could be broken apart. In the end, Majestic 12 lives much like the hotel, in a liminal state. The skeptics have their evidence, typographical slips, historical anachronisms, the FBI's bogus label. The believers have theirs, the credibility of the names, the strange accuracy of certain details, the very fact that the documents have appeared at all. What was undeniable was the effect. The MJ-12 split ufology in two. It forced researchers to choose a side, to stand with Friedman's dogged defense, or Klass's ruthless skepticism. And perhaps that was the point all along. Because from the beginning, Majestic 12 thrived not on certainty, but on division. It drew strength from the argument, from the inability of either side to fully disprove the other. Here at the Dreamland Motel, you can still feel that fracture. On one side of the hallway, the believers gather, whispering about Truman's memo and Eisenhower's briefing. On the other, the skeptics linger, pointing out the typos, the fonts, the too modern words. In the middle, the rest of us stand, listening to the echoes, wondering. Because in my opinion, the cracks that appeared in Majestic 12 were not just in the documents. They were in us, in our ability to believe, to doubt, and to argue over shadows. And once those cracks appeared, they never truly closed again. The arrival of the MJ-12 papers marks a turning point, a moment when the desire for something to be real may have reshaped the standards of evidence themselves. This document is mesmerizing. It makes sense in many ways. I want it to be real. But wanting is not knowing. At the end of the day, it remains unverified, a file that could be completely fictional. And for me, one red flag has always loomed: the proximity of these pages to a known disinformation agent. That doesn't mean it's false, but it doesn't make it true either. What it does is occupy that strange liminal space, where history and hoax blur, and where plausibility becomes its own form of power. And maybe this is why Majestic 12 lingers. Not because we can prove it, but because we can't let it go. The legend of Majestic 12 did not end with Jamie Chanderay's roll of film. It grew, multiplied, and, like any good story, it developed sequels. Because once a secret like MJ-12 was in the world, it didn't just sit there. It attracted new fragments, new claims, new papers drifting out of the shadows. Some were delivered like the originals, anonymous packages, undeveloped film, mysterious mail drops. Others arrived more brazenly, through photocopied documents passed at conferences, or whispered hints of classified projects, whose names alone seem electrifying. By the early 1990s, Majestic 12 was no longer a single story. It was a canon, a whole mythology of shadow governance, sprawling across decades, always just one leak away from revelation. The first major sequel appeared in 1985. Researcher Bill Moore, with Jamie Chandera and Stanton Friedman, claimed to have uncovered another MJ-12 document This one not mailed, but physically discovered in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. It was short, just a one-page memo. Dated July 14th, 1954, supposedly written by Robert Cutler, then Special Assistant to President Eisenhower. It was addressed to General Nathan Twining, one of the 12 named in the original Eisenhower briefing. The memo referenced an MJ-12 Special Studies project, as if casually confirming that Majestic 12 was real, alive, and conducting business under Eisenhower's watch. Finding it in the archives gave it a veneer of authenticity. How could a forged document end up in the National Archives? Unless, of course, someone had planted it there. And that was exactly the suspicion. Philip Klass, ever the debunker, noted that Cutler had been out of the country on the date of the memo. Critics pointed out that the formatting of the document didn't match Eisenhower-era paperwork. The phrase MJ-12 itself appeared clumsily, almost like it had been inserted just to hook UFO hunters. To those that believe it's real, the memo was a crown jewel, physical evidence that could be held in one's hands, as if MJ-12 had finally stepped into the daylight. But documents were only the beginning. Soon came the code names. In the late 1980s, whispers emerged of Project Aquarius, supposedly a program dedicated to collecting and analysing all UFO-related intelligence. Aquarius appeared in leaked papers circulated by William Moore, Richard Doty, and others tied to the Benowitz affair. The documents spoke of decades of contact, of communication with extraterrestrials, of vast databases cataloguing sightings, crashes, and recovered technology. Alongside Aquarius came Project Sigma, allegedly a communications initiative, said to have established contact with extraterrestrial visitors as early as the 1950s. In some tellings, Sigma was linked to secret meetings between US officials and non-human beings, even negotiations. Whether Aquarius and Sigma were real projects, clever hoaxes, or carefully planted disinformation, they carried the same stylistic DNA as the Majestic 12 briefing. Dry, bureaucratic language. All caps code names. Hints of extraordinary secrets wrapped in ordinary formatting. And just like that, MJ-12 wasn't just a committee anymore. It was a whole ecosystem of classified programs, each with its own mythology, each feeding into the same vast cover-up. The more documents surfaced, the harder it became to separate wheat from chaff. Some were obvious fakes, photocopies with misspellings, formatting errors, anachronistic language. Others were harder to dismiss, matching genuine archival styles and leaving experts divided. But the very ambiguity fueled the fire. Each new leak, real or forged, was folded into the MJ-12 umbrella. By the 1990s, the canon had expanded to include not just Roswell and Wright-Patterson, but Dulce bases, alien treaties, underground laboratories, and hybridization programs. The story became less about a secret committee and more about a secret empire, a shadow government, unelected and untouchable, managing not just UFOs, but the fate of humanity. To skeptics, this was the surest sign of fraud. To believers, it was proof of scale. By the time the 1990s UFO revival was underway, Majestic 12 had grown into a kind of shorthand. Say MJ12 at a UFO conference, and it no longer just meant a 12-man panel in 1947. It meant everything. Roswell, crashed discs, autopsied bodies, alien treaties signed in secret, black budgets and hidden bases, disinformation agents in the community. It became a synonym for the invisible framework of secrecy itself. Even mainstream media picked up the echo. Television shows, books, and films borrowed the aura of MJ12, sometimes explicitly, sometimes in thinly veiled allusions. The X-Files, for instance, transformed MJ12 into a household name, embedding it into the culture of the 1990s as the archetypal shadow government. And so Majestic 12, whether born in truth or hoax, accomplished something extraordinary. It created mythology robust enough to grow, to expand, and to evolve. MJ12 feels less like a single leak and more like a living organism. One document begat another. One name gave rise to code words. Each fragment multiplied until the whole structure stood before us, a towering edifice of secrecy, half built from truth, half built from imagination. Whether you believe it or not is almost irrelevant. It exists now as a system in the collective mind, a shadow cabinet haunting the corridors of power, possibly forever just out of reach. And once such a myth takes root, it's difficult to shrink, and all too easy to grow. In the 1990s, Majestic 12 had ceased to just be a handful of disputed documents. It had become a living, breathing ecosystem of stories, a mythos, a framework that could hold on to almost anything. Leaks, hoaxes, testimonies, theories. Some of those stories orbited close to the original Eisenhower briefing. Others drifted into territory so wild, so baroque, that they seemed like science fiction delivered in a manila envelope. Among them, the claims of Dan Burisch, the tale of Project Serpo, and the ever-whispered suggestion that all of this was tied to a treaty, a deal between humans and something that wasn't. We won't linger too long here, because if you've checked into this motel before, you'll know there's already an entire episode devoted to the saga of Dan Burisch. The short version is this. Burisch, a microbiologist, claimed he had been recruited to work under Majestic 12's supervision. His alleged task was staggering, studying a mysterious tissue sample said to come from a non-human entity connected to a crashed UFO. Over time, his story expanded to include direct interactions with a live, non-human intelligence, being held at a secret mountainside base called S4, just south of Area 51. He talked of a secret treaty with extraterrestrials, timelines in collapse, and the looming need to renew an interspecies agreement that, if broken, could spell catastrophe. Whether you see Burisch as whistleblower, fabulist, or something in between, what matters here is not the truth of his account, but the fact that it is so easily slotted into the MJ12 framework. Majestic wasn't just about crash retrievals anymore. It was about diplomacy, about the management of an ongoing relationship with whatever had fallen out of the skies in 1947. And Burisch wasn't the only one to make that leap. If Burisch's story was intricate, the Serpo project was sprawling. It emerged in the mid-2000s, when anonymous emails began appearing on UFO list serves, claiming to come from a retired US defense official. The emails told of a program allegedly launched in the 1960s, the culmination of arrangements made after Roswell. According to these messages, 12 American military personnel had been carefully selected for a one-way mission. Their destination, Serpo, a planet in the Zeta Reticuli system. Yes, the same star system connected to the famous Betty and Barney Hill abduction case, where the star map shown to Betty under hypnosis was later matched, uncannily, some argued, to Zeta Reticuli. The same Zeta Reticuli that Bob Lazar says he saw in briefing documents before his time at S4. The Serpo volunteers, the story went, boarded an alien craft in 1965. 10 of them would live for over a decade among extraterrestrials, studying their society, their technology, their way of life. Only a handful returned to Earth. The details poured out like serialized fiction. The Serpoans' day lasted 43 Earth hours. Their population was around 650,000. Their government was collective, their technology advanced, their lives regimented. Communication was difficult, but possible. Some of the Americans died on Serpo, unable to adjust to the alien food, atmosphere, or radiation. Even mundane details were offered. Measurements of the Serpoan year, descriptions of their dwellings, reports of their burial customs. The more specific the claims became, the more compelling the story felt, at least to those who wanted to believe. What does this have to do with MJ12? Everything. Because the Serpo story was never told as an isolated event. From the very beginning, its narrators claimed the exchange program had been overseen by none other than Majestic 12. In fact, the Eisenhower briefing had provided the seed. Buried in that disputed 1952 memo was mention of 2 crash retrievals, Roswell in 1947 and the other near the Texas-Mexico border in 1950. If there were multiple crashes, why not ongoing contact? If a committee of scientists and generals had been created to manage the fallout, why wouldn't they also manage an exchange? The Serpo tale painted Majestic not just as keepers of the secrets, but as interstellar diplomats, men quietly negotiating the terms of humanity's first exchange program. And this is where the boundaries blur, because while the MJ12 documents had at least the patina of paper, typewriters and signatures, Serpo was born entirely of the internet age. No film canister slipped through a mail slot. No briefing labelled Magic Eyes Only. Just digital words on a screen. But the name Majestic 12 gave it ballast, a tether. Without MJ12, Serpo might have read like pure fantasy. With MJ12, it could be slotted into a larger narrative. It could feel like a sequel. Hovering behind Burisch and Serpo is the deeper motif, the idea of a treaty. Whistleblowers and theorists alike have suggested that after Roswell, the United States government did not simply study what it had recovered. It negotiated. The allegation is stark. Sometime in the early 1950s, a deal was struck between human authorities and non-human visitors. Technology would be exchanged for access. Some versions claim it was access to land or to airspace. Others whisper it was access to us, to human beings, in limited numbers, for purposes never made explicit. Dan Burisch claimed he was working on the biology of this treaty's legacy. The Serpo tale positioned the exchange program as its most dramatic manifestation, and countless others have filled in the gaps, painting MJ-12 as the quiet administrators of this interstellar contract. The logic for believers was compelling. After all, technology did leap forward in the post-war years. Transistors, integrated circuits, stealth, lasers. Crashes were reported again and again. And secrecy was clearly institutionalized, with compartmentalization and intelligence structures designed to keep the deepest truths far from public view. If the government was dealing with something beyond human control, what would be more natural than to put it into legalistic terms, to treat it like diplomacy, to write it into a treaty? The beauty, or perhaps the danger, of the treaty theory is that it makes Majestic 12 feel inevitable. Because if a treaty existed, someone has to enforce it. Someone had to manage the terms, renegotiate when necessary, cover up the mistakes, and quietly bury the dead when things went wrong. That someone was MJ-12. And so, in the law, the committee becomes not just a secret study group, but a permanent shadow government, a bureaucracy with extraterrestrial jurisdiction, the very face of hidden diplomacy. What we see, looking back from the vantage of the motel, is how effortlessly MJ-12 became a container. Into it you can pour the tale of a microbiologist studying alien cells, or the saga of 12 Americans stepping onto a distant planet, or the suspicion that humanity's future was mortgaged in a secret deal signed under Truman or Eisenhower. Whether you believe or doubt, the pattern is clear. Majestic 12 is a stage, and story after story has taken to it. By the turn of the new millennium, MJ-12 wasn't just a list of names on a disputed document. It was a legend, one that could flex to hold every fear, every hope, every rumour about what our government might be doing behind locked doors. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of those stories, you can hear the faint echo of the original question. Not just what is true, but who wanted us to believe it? In the world of UFO lore, some names fade with time, dissolving into the haze of forgotten sightings and half-remembered rumours. But not Majestic 12. From the moment it surfaced, MJ-12 did something few pieces of ufological evidence ever manage. It stepped beyond the confines of the UFO community and bled into culture at large. The story was too cinematic to stay locked away in archives or in the pages of photocopied newsletters. A secret presidential directive, a committee of 12 powerful men, alien bodies in cold storage, the kind of narrative that almost writes itself. And write itself it did. Within a few years of Jamie Chanderay unspooling that mysterious roll of film, the phrase Majestic 12 began cropping up not just in UFO books and conferences, but in novels, television, films, video games, and even the shorthand of political discourse. MJ12 had escaped into the wild. As previously mentioned, the first real pop culture tidal wave came in the late 80s, when Above Top Secret, Timothy Good's best-selling UFO survey, reprinted the MJ12 documents. Soon after, Stanton Friedman devoted his own book, Top Secret Magic, to defending them. These books landed on the shelves not of specialist UFO shops, but in ordinary bookstores, where curious browsers could stumble on them in the current affairs or science sections. Suddenly, the idea of a shadow government dealing with alien secrets was no longer confined to mimeographed newsletters passed around at MUFON meetings. It was on the racks next to biographies of presidents. Television soon followed. In '88, the live primetime special, UFO Cover-Up Live, broadcast to millions across America, featured clips and references to Majestic 12. That same year, ABC's Nightline ran a segment on the documents. For a moment, the possibility of a real hidden committee managing UFO secrets was not just the talk of conferences. It was headline news. And once an idea like that enters the mainstream, storytellers start to notice. As I said before, no show did more to cement MJ12 in the cultural imagination than The X-Files. From its debut in '93, the series became the pop culture backbone of conspiracy consciousness. Its central premise, two FBI agents uncovering evidence of a vast government cover-up of extraterrestrials. In one way, MJ12 was the star of the show. They weren't always named outright, but its fingerprints were all over it. Scully's backstory reveals her thesis was on the plausibility of the existence of extraterrestrials and the likelihood of government conspiracy, such as Majestic 12. In another early episode, the term EBE, extraterrestrial biological entity, lifted directly from the MJ12 documents, becomes the title of a story about a captured alien transported under armed guard. For millions of viewers, this was their first brush with Majestic 12. Even if the name itself was softened or obscured, the idea had become an archetype. The hidden committee, the cabal of powerful men, the secret archive buried beneath desert sand. MJ12 also found fertile ground in the screens of gamers. The cult classic Deus Ex introduced Majestic 12 as one of the hidden factions controlling world affairs, operating alongside the Illuminati and other clandestine groups. Players could sneak through MJ12 laboratories, uncover documents, and confront its operatives. For a younger generation, the name Majestic 12 was less a disputed UFO document and more a narrative trope, a storytelling shorthand for ultimate secrecy. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Majestic 12 lies outside the UFO world altogether. By the 1990s, MJ12 had become a kind of prototype for the modern idea of the deep state. Its imagery, a secret committee of unelected officials operating outside democratic accountability, pulling strings from the shadows, resonated far beyond Roswell. Conspiracy literature about the New World Order, secret cabals, and hidden elites freely borrowed from MJ12's mythos. Even when the alien element was dropped, the structure remained: a secret council, a clandestine chain of command, the suggestion that power does not rest with presidents or parliaments, but with men whose names you'll never know. The irony is that for many, the very bogus label attached to the MJ12 documents gave the legend more fuel. If the FBI said it was fake, wasn't that exactly what they would say if they were real? If the documents were clumsy forgeries, then why had they so perfectly captured the public imagination? MJ12 became less a claim about history than a metaphor for secrecy itself. Sitting here in the Dreamland Motel, with the hum of the neon sign leaking through the curtains, it's easy to see why MJ12 took on such cultural gravity. It offered storytellers a ready-made villain, researchers a tantalizing clue, and conspiracy theorists a template for hidden power. It slipped from photocopied pages into network television, from obscure newsletters into primetime drama, from a potential classified hoax into cultural archetype. Majestic 12 began as a handful of pages, leaked from the highest corridors of government. But, over time, it became more than that. It was an idea, and ideas, once loose, are hard to kill. Why does Majestic 12 still haunt us? After all, the evidence against it has been rehearsed endlessly. The Truman memo looked pasted. The Eisenhower briefing reads suspiciously modern. The FBI stamped bogus on the whole affair nearly 40 years ago. And yet here we are, still circling those 12 names, still invoking MJ12 as though it were the master key to the UFO mystery. In a way, the persistence of the Majestic 12 is stranger than the documents themselves. Part of the answer lies in history. The MJ12 papers didn't appear in the 1960s, when the UFO debate was fresh and the culture was still reeling from Roswell. They arrived in 1984, a year thick with Cold War paranoia. Reagan was talking about evil empires and launching the Strategic Defense Initiative. The nuclear clock ticked closer to midnight. The idea that the government might create a secret body, invisible to oversight, to guard against an existential threat, it fit the mood of the time with uncanny precision. America already lived with alphabet agencies born of secrecy. CIA, NSA, DIA. Adding one more to the soup, especially one whose initials were whispered rather than printed, didn't feel outlandish. It felt expected. MJ12, in other words, wasn't just a UFO story. It was a Cold War story, perfectly tuned to its environment. And then, of course, there were the names. This was the true genius of the documents, or the authenticity, depending on your persuasion. Whoever assembled that list didn't reach for obscure colonels or invented bureaucrats. They chose giants. Bush, Forrestal, Vandenberg, Hillenkotter. Every name rang true. Every name was verifiable. For those who wanted to believe, it was devastating. For skeptics, it was damningly clever. Either way, the list of the 12 men tethered MJ12 to reality. It wasn't mythology, it was history, repurposed and repainted in shadow. The seductive power of MJ12 is that it resolves the question that nags at the edge of every UFO debate. Who knows? When pilots see something, when radar tracks an impossible object, when crash debris is rumoured, someone must be briefed. Someone must have the files. But who? Presidents come and go. Generals retire. Scientists die. Who carries the torch? MJ12 provided that answer. Here, in 12 names on a list, was the inner circle, the continuity, the mechanism by which secrecy could outlive administrations, budgets, even lifespans, a perpetual committee of hidden stewards passing the secret from one to the next like a torch in the dark. It's very satisfying. If the Majestic 12 is fake, and to be clear, I'm not saying it is, it tells a real story regardless. Because secrecy itself is a kind of truth. The Cold War produced an architecture of classified programs so vast, so compartmentalized, that the public scarcely knew where government ended and mystery began. Black budgets, special access programs, unacknowledged special access programs, waived unacknowledged special access programs, projects buried under code names and then buried again. In that landscape, MJ12 didn't need to exist to feel real. It was a mirror of the system itself. A document, even if forged, can still capture an authentic anxiety. A false signature can still reveal the shape of hidden power. And that, perhaps, is why MJ12 refuses to die. Because it embodies the truth of secrecy, whether or not it embodies the truth of UFOs. Sit with that for a moment. In tonight's motel room, with the neon buzzing and the clock ticking into midnight. Imagine 12 men bent over a table in Washington, deciding what the public can never know. Imagine the folders passed hand to hand, the photographs never published, the artifacts hidden away. Whether it happened under the banner of Majestic 12 is in some sense beside the point. What matters is that the world we live in makes such a thing plausible. And plausibility is the fuel of myth. That is the enduring question of Majestic 12. Not whether it is real, but why it feels real. Why it still feels like truth hiding just out of reach. Because in the end, MJ12 is not simply about aliens. It's about trust. It's about power. And it's about the dark gravity of secrecy itself. A force as enduring and as mysterious as the phenomenon it was meant to conceal. So, let us play the thought experiment. If Majestic 12 was real in 1947, if it was real in 1952, then what about now? Committees do not stay frozen in amber. Forrestal is long dead. Vandenberg, Twining, Bush, all gone. If Majestic 12 survived, the chairs would have been filled by others. New names, new faces. Who would they be? Leave a comment below with who you think might make the cut today. Would it be the heads of DARPA, black budget scientists shuffling through files at midnight? Would it be billionaires who now hold more technological power than entire governments? Would it be the directors of intelligence agencies, or bankers, or some strange hybrid? A council of officials, corporate leaders, and invisible hands who sit together in hidden rooms, still carrying the torch first lit at Roswell. Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, Elon Musk, Sam Altman, Lou Elizondo? Or perhaps it's no longer 12 at all. After all, the original whistleblower himself, Bob Lazar, had an ID card. And on that ID card, yep, allegedly, the letters MAJ. But perhaps it's not even called Majestic anymore. Maybe the secret has become institutional, embedded into the machinery of special access programs, where no one person knows the whole. The committee dissolves into process, faceless, endless, self-perpetuating, and self-confining. To me, that is the most chilling possibility of all, that the names no longer matter, that the very idea of MJ12 was simply a mask, worn by a system that long outlived it, and has since completely lost control. My opinion on all this? I believe Roswell happened. I believe it was covered up. I believe the names on that original list were reasonable ones to assume would be in the positions they were allegedly given. And I believe the need for a controlling entity, for someone to manage the truths we learned in those years, was real. Do I think MJ12 exists today, in 2025? No. I don't think there are 12 chosen men sitting in a smoke-filled room, responsible for all things cover-up. This has grown too big. Too many contractors, too many whistleblowers, too many cracks in the wall. Could it have started as 12 chosen men? Absolutely. But do I think the documents themselves are genuine? I can't say that. If they're fake, the question is why? Who would benefit from such an elaborate deception? And if MJ12 no longer exists, then what replaced it? Did the committee dissolve into the faceless sprawl of agencies, programs, and private companies that make up the modern secrecy machine? Or does some hidden echo of it still sit in the shadows, guiding policy we'll never see? The truth may be that the power of MJ12 isn't in whether it exists today, but in the way its story taught us to think about secrecy, power, and the possibility of hidden, unaccounted for governance. Return with me, then, to the quiet motel room, the envelope, the roll of film. Maybe it was fake, maybe planted, maybe nothing at all, but the names remain, haunting us. Ghosts of a committee that may never have met, yet still govern ufology in myth, if not in fact. Here in the Dreamland Motel, we understand that sometimes the greatest secrets are not about what happened, but about what could have happened. The line between history and imagination blurs. We are left not with certainty, but with a shape in the dark, a possibility that refuses to vanish. And that's just the way we like it. Thanks for staying with us tonight. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing. It helps us make sure there's always a room waiting for you when the night grows too long and the questions grow too heavy. We'll see you next time. And remember, sometimes the power of a secret isn't that it's true. It's that we believe it must be. Good night.